and other type of Proud Boy fundraisers have taken place on this platform. So now the money has sort of been going through there. That has now also been frozen. So it's really unclear where the money is going, who's in charge of it, how it's going to get dispersed, if at all. And I think that's important, to kind of identify how people's donations is one kind of political choice in order to demonstrate support for these folks. But as, again, my fellow panelists have alluded to, there is a real misunderstanding of who is in charge and where the money is going to go and kind of who is benefiting from this. And it seems really easy for folks who are not actually affiliated with the movement in any meaningful way to make a quick buck off of the energy and enthusiasm from certain corners for this movement.
And when we talk about large amounts of money in total, for the GoFundMe account, we're looking at about north of $9 million. And when we talk about the Give, Send, Go account, it was about $6 million in just 3 days. Michael, I want to follow up on that. Anya had mentioned, these accounts will essentially be frozen soon to the Emergencies Act. So is all this money rendered useless? Where will it go? Will it be refunded?
In the end, when the government seizes the money under the emergencies legislation, it will essentially go at this point where the government decides. Presumably, there'll be some effort to return some of it. The government will be under no obligation under the emergencies legislation to return it. And in some cases, it will be difficult even to find the original donors if they were given under anonymous donations. But Canadians they're a little bit baffled. Why would so many Americans and American political figures be so concerned to send money to a Canadian protest? It's because they see opportunity. It's the same way that philanthropists invest in causes. They feel that there's likely to be a return on investment in seeing a result, either a socially desirable one from the perspective of philanthropy, or a political one in furthering ideals of destabilizing centralized welfare state governance, authorities, medical authority, to create space generally for far-right ideas. So you would have essentially misanthropes that see an opportunity to send large sums of money to fund destabilization that just generally creates space for these ideas. They're not particularly interested in outcomes in Canada, particularly. It's just more space that normalizes the ideas that they value.
Brett, I want to follow up, on that note that, it has nothing to do with maybe trucker mandates for a lot of these people and the COVID restrictions here in Canada. To what extent are these protests in Canada grassroots versus being influenced from abroad?
I think it's important that we just acknowledge that there are a diversity of stakeholders here, some of whom are everyday Canadians who are just tired. A lot of people who have been unemployed or seen their businesses adversely affected. And then there are more extreme elements here within Canada. There are more extreme elements from outside of Canada, and then there are sort of right-wing political interests in the United States. And all of them are trying to use this, I think, as an opportunity to create a groundswell of support for a larger international movement, maybe the equivalent of something like an Occupy Wall Street for the right.
All right, I want to show a short clip. This is a clip from Fox News, and it sort of gives us a sense of, among other right-wing broadcasters in the U.S., of how they are covering this convoy.
Canada's working class has finally rebelled after years of relentless abuse. Truck drivers are threatening to topple Justin Trudeau's creepy little government with their big rigs. And they may succeed, actually. The protests against Justin Trudeau's vaccine mandates have been far more effective than anyone in charge imagined. For Democrats in the United States, that's a pretty obvious lesson.
Now, Anya and Brett, it's very rare, I think, to see Canada topping the headlines in pretty much every single newscast for the past couple of weeks. Anya, what effect do you think that type of American coverage is having on the movement here?
I spoke with a political scientist who talked about Canada really kind of being a symbol in the minds of Americans. If you are a liberal American, you see it as kind of a socialist paradise where everyone is very kind to each other. And if you are a conservative American, you see it as, evidence of a socialist hellscape where you have no individual freedoms. And I think you're really seeing that in the American media, that this, again, has nothing to do, I think, with a particular perspective on Justin Trudeau and the Trudeau government, or on the Canadian political system, or on the vast and diverse history of Canada as a nation, that it really has to do with being able to cast aspersions on a particular style of governance that right-wing media does not want to see here in the United States, that they perhaps see as a stand-in for Joe Biden. And so I think, again, you're seeing a lot of projection. We have no kind of real indication that this is a working class revolt. It doesn't represent, even close to the majority of truckers. I believe 90% of truckers have already been vaccinated. It doesn't represent anywhere close to the majority of Canadians. You guys enjoy one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. And so really, I think a lot of the right-wing media rhetoric is more about kind of setting the stage for ongoing frustration against these policies and ideas more broadly here in the States and around the world. So really kind of using Canada as a stand-in rather than talking about Canada as a real diverse place.
And I should mention, it's not just the media. Former U.S. President Donald Trump also chimed in, and he said, "We want those great Canadian truckers to know that we are with them all the way." Michael, I'm curious, is American media willing an American copycat convoy movement into existence by talking about it so much? We know that there's going to be sort of a protest being planned in the early days of March. Do you think because we're talking about it, because it's in the headlines, that for their part to blame?
Well, it's certainly promoting the idea, I'm sure in some media outlets in a deliberate type of way. What I will also say, though, I definitely agree with my panelists here that this is not a unified movement. Most of the protesters we see are easygoing people with concerns about vaccine mandates, the friendly face of the protest in the bouncy castles and barbecuing and all of that. These are not the enemies of democracy. And I have found in my opportunities to speak with Americans, through NPR and other forums, they sort of intuitively grasp what's going on in Canada more quickly than Canadians do, because they're used to this. They're used to seeing protest that's fanned up by a small number of non-Democrats to get ordinary people riled up over issues of the day, whether it's COVID-19 or something else that aggravates people, and manipulating those images into suggesting that any state response is a crackdown on ordinary Americans, or in this case, Canadians. Americans get that much more quickly because it's well within their concept of experience. They've seen it many times. We have not.
Brett, I'm hoping you can chime in here in terms of international reputation. I think when I showed those earlier photos of the Canadian flag, I think 3 weeks ago, the Canadian flag represented something a little bit different. But now when you look at that image, it seems quite interesting. And I'm curious, what does this mean for Canada's international reputation?
Oh, well, I agree completely with both of my panelists here. The portrayal of Canada in U.S. media is a political football. It is a proxy for a longer cultural war that's being waged between the right and left ends of the political spectrum in the United States. I think the potency of this particular protest is that it does undermine the performance of the Canadian economy. What's going on in Ottawa is very interesting to me, but the real sort of pressure point that they've identified are the bridges. So the Ambassador Bridge is worth approximately $300 million a day in trade between Canada and the United States. And the occupation of that bridge, I think, to me, shows a willingness of this particular group of people to inflict widespread harm, indiscriminate harm. Because, of course, shutting down that bridge interrupts patterns of trade, which is particularly important to the automotive industry in the Northeast on both sides of the border. So it's not just that they're interrupting flows of finished goods. These are intermediate goods that are used in the automotive industry. So you're impacting workers on both sides of the border, from Ontario all the way down to the south of the United States. It's also impacting other truckers, right? Because if you're trying to cross at the Ambassador Bridge, now you have to go to a different point and you're piled up in a long queue there. So I think one of the things that this group is going to ultimately have to answer to is how the media portrays them and what public sentiment is towards them, given how willing they are to sort of inflict widespread harm to a number of different people.
Michael, I'm curious to know, did Canadians underestimate how divided we are?
Almost definitely. That was the main reason why we were unable to compute the threat as it literally approached us down the highway. We could see it coming, but we just could not conceive of what it was. We could not imagine that there are a large number of people in our society who simply do not accept the word of the government at face value, that we are divided on our interpretations of science, on our interpretations of collective benefit. We thought we did not have these divisions in our society, that we simply have a kind of consensus around the Canadian model. It is not the case. And it was coming down the highway. We could not conceive of it. We've now taken a close look at it here in Ottawa and at the crossing points, and we'll be better prepared to recognize it next time and set up our institutions to deal with it in a more constructive way.
As we know, we're in week 3 of these protests in Ottawa, and I'm curious, Anya, as COVID dies down, what do you think this group could morph into?
We're looking at the potential arrival of the movement here in the States. And I think an interesting parallel there is that we do not have a unified COVID response here. In many of the places that the proposed convoy would pass through, restrictions have been gone for a while. By the time they reach DC, if they do end up following the timeline they've proposed, the mask mandate here will have been lifted. And so the fact that this can kind of congeal at a time when those restrictions that they are protesting against aren't really present, to me indicates that this can have legs far beyond COVID itself, that COVID gives, again, a real avenue to express legitimate personal experiences and emotions and grievances, but the folks who would kind of harness it for other purposes can latch onto that and really kind of propel it in many different directions. And I just want to note that the planning here in the United States has a particularly kind of fringe element to it. One of the maps that's been released of a potential path has an explicit neo-Nazi meme in the bottom corner, a Pepe the Frog reference. And so watching groups kind of utilize, again, real people, real experiences in order to hopefully move them into a further right, more extremist ideology, I think it's something really important to be paying attention to.
Now, in our last few minutes, I wanna kind of get down into that question there, Brett. You know, I'm curious. You know, what is the ultimate victory, or how do we measure the success of this protest from the protesters' point of view? And sort of on that same note, you know, what happens when COVID dies down?
I think that Canadians need to recognize that we're in a sort of political inflection point here. And the question for me is, what happens to this mobilization going forward? One of the measures of success is short term. You can sit around and wait for mask mandates to sort of fall to the wayside, maybe even vaccine mandates to fall away. Maybe the pandemic recedes. That would be nice. And then you can claim that those are as a response to your movement. And I'm not sure how convincing that will be. That some of that may be inevitable. I think the long-term success of this organization will be whether or not there's an organization to it. This is a leaderless movement by and large right now, and it's a messy coalition. It reminds me somewhat of like the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle back in '99. It was the Teamsters and the Turtles, where you saw everybody from progressives to hardcore conservatives like Pat Buchanan. but also somewhat like Occupy Wall Street. At some point, a movement has to adopt some sort of formal organization and has to articulate its vision, its objectives, and coalesce around something. And this organization is so horizontal right now and is playing host to so many disparate groups. Who's going to be part of that and what their objectives are, I think, are really important. The danger here for this organization is that because the rallying cry is freedom and liberty, a lot of that economic anxiety tends to fall around things like immigration, which makes it susceptible to the extremist right-wing groups. And if that's where it goes, I think it'll have difficulty in Canada. Part of the reason the populist movement has taken over the conservative movement in the United States is because of the Senate's, outsized emphasis that it gives to rural voters, and the political elections for the president can be won without a majority. It's different in Canada. I think that it is more important for them to galvanize public sentiment and support for their movement.
I got about 30 seconds left, and I want to make sure I get Michael in this because obviously you're in Ottawa. I'm sure you want to see this come to an end some way, but I'm curious, as COVID dies down, what happens here?
Well, once the streets are cleared, ultimately the Canadian state will have to make the most of the inquiry that is mandatory with the Emergencies Act. That inquiry focuses on every reason that the Emergencies Act was necessary at all, which is to say, to identify all the system's failures that were unable to deal with this challenge with police, the different levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal, security agencies, intelligence agencies, so that we are ready for next time. Our democratic institutions are fixed, so we do not find ourselves in the similar emergency situation in the future.
Michael, Anya, Brett, thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you kindly.
Pleasure.
Presumably, one does not become head of the Chinese military, the Communist Party, and the 7th president of the People's Republic of China without having a pretty firm vision of what to do with so much power. Xi Jinping has occupied all of those roles for almost a decade now. Elizabeth Economy is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Her new book sheds a good bit of light on what Xi's plan includes. The book is called The World According to China. And Elizabeth Economy joins me now from Washington, D.C. with more. It's great to have you back on our program. How are you doing?
Great, Steve. It's great to be with you. Thank you.
Since taking power nearly a decade ago, what do you think Xi can point to as his greatest achievement in office?
I think for Xi Jinping, his greatest achievement is simply staying in power. I think, one of the things that we've seen over the past decade has just been this extraordinary consolidation of power. And, at this point in time, we'd anticipate that we begin to see, the next generation emerging. Next fall, this fall 2022, is going to be the, 20th Party Congress. There will be the reselection of a new general secretary. We would have thought that we'd know who's going to be following Xi Jinping as general secretary, as the next president come the spring. But instead, it's really all Xi Jinping all the time. So I think, not being too facetious, I think that probably is in his own mind his greatest accomplishment. Beyond that, though, certainly China has experienced a fairly extraordinary rise on the global stage. And if you look back to 2017 and his speech when he was reselected as General Secretary of the Communist Party for his second 5-year term, he talked about, his period really as being the period of China becoming strong and moving towards center stage. And I think we've certainly seen that over the past 10 years, that China, that new degree of Chinese centrality on the global stage.
Mm-hmm. Well, I acknowledge this next question is being asked through a bit of a Western lens here, so forgive the language, but how much do you think China is willing to destabilize the international world order, sacrifice trade and investment, become essentially a pariah internationally in order to get to where it wants to get to?
So, I mean, it's an important question, and I think you are asking it in a dramatic fashion. But I think at the heart of it is really, is Xi Jinping just reforming the international system? And I would argue he is transforming it, and his vision is transformative. And it includes basically redrawing the map of China and the Indo-Pacific, replacing the United States as the regional hegemon in Asia. Embedding Chinese values in other countries, so getting other countries to align with Chinese policy preferences. I think really reconfiguring the nature of the global economy so that China is not only central to it, but that it is much more self-contained and in fact, basically a much more self-sufficient China economy within the context of a globalized economy. And then, China reforming sort of its norms and values within international institutions. And I think when you take all of that together, it is a fairly radical transformation of the international system as we know it. And how willing is he to sort of destabilize it or to, he has a much higher risk profile than previous Chinese leaders, I think. And we saw that, during the first 6 months of the pandemic, when he, when China, while all the rest of the world was focused on battling COVID-19, we saw Xi Jinping basically, demonstrate this extraordinary degree of military assertiveness. China and India had their first deadly battle, border conflict in 40 years. China staked claim to, a territory within Bhutan, very assertive in sort of Malaysian and Indonesian territorial waters around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands in Japan. And of course, many ramped up its sort of air incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. So, here's the rest of the world, right, focused on battling this, really devastating pandemic. And Xi Jinping decides this is a time, right, to press forward on his territorial claims. I think that says a lot about sort of how he places his priorities and what that stability means to him or doesn't mean.
Well, I acknowledge the language in the question was a tad provocative, but it is informed by the following numbers. Pew Research, they looked at how different countries and their citizens around the world view China. Let's just share some of the numbers here. How many people surveyed in Canada have an unfavorable view of China? 73%. In the United States, it's 76%. If you go to Europe, Germans, 7 out of 10 have an unfavorable view of China. In the UK, 63%. Interestingly, in Greece, only 42%. But get closer to China. Japan, 88%. 78% of Aussies, 77% of South Koreans, only a third of people in Singapore, interestingly enough. And what percentage of citizens around the world have confidence that Xi Jinping would, quote unquote, do the right thing regarding world affairs? The overall median average is 77% of countries surveyed have no confidence in the Chinese leader doing the right thing. Only 20% said they had confidence that he would do the right thing. And I guess the question emerging from that is, do the Chinese even care about those numbers?
Yeah, I do think it's startling. And I think there are Chinese who do care in the foreign policy community. And I think some of those numbers reflect that, wolf warrior diplomacy that we saw during the COVID pandemic. The sort of threatening to take away the provision of personal protective equipment when China was really the dominant provider of it. If countries criticized, China's response to the pandemic, or we saw, the boycott, we still see the boycott of Australian goods because Australia dared to ask for an investigation into the origins of COVID. And I think, China managed to turn what should have been a pretty significant diplomatic win into a diplomatic debacle, all on its own. This is really an own goal by Xi Jinping because, he used this opportunity to sort of, to try to leverage, the Chinese economy and its control over PPE to coerce countries. And I think that was a significant mistake because, as you point out, we've got these popular opinion polls that demonstrate really no confidence, in Xi Jinping as a global leader, even as, the Chinese elite continue to sort of pump out this idea that the East is rising and the West is declining and that China would be such a much more benign, right, global leader than, for example, the United States. So I think, it's funny. This past summer, Xi Jinping called on his diplomats to create an image of China that was more respectable and lovable and credible. And I think it represents sort of a fundamental disconnect between, Xi Jinping's understanding that, after a decade of watching his leadership, right, of watching how China behaves on the global stage, it really doesn't matter what Chinese diplomats say anymore, what image they try to create. People globally can look and see the actions of China on the ground and understand what China's leadership would entail. So, I think he faces, a significant diplomatic backlash from the way that he's conducted his sort of COVID diplomacy and other things, of course, that he's been doing on the global stage. But just to finish to your point, do they care? Again, I think some in China care, but I think Xi Jinping is speaking primarily to his domestic audience. And that sort of, you hit us and we hit back mentality does appeal to a significant portion of the Chinese population.
Well, let me follow up by asking about this huge initiative that China has made, an outreach both economically and diplomatically to 60 countries around the world, $200 billion in investment, the Belt and Road Initiative. Is that, in your judgment, working?
So the Belt and Road Initiative, right, which was launched back in 2013 by Xi Jinping and began as sort of a hard infrastructure project to connect the lesser developed parts of the country to external markets in the rest of Asia and Europe, Middle East to Africa, has expanded since he first announced it from, the 60 or 65 countries to include every country in the world. Now it's not just about hard infrastructure, it's about digital infrastructure. There's a digital Silk Road, which is fiber optic cables and e-commerce and satellite systems. There's a health Silk Road, which is pushing traditional Chinese medicine, a polar Silk Road. Virtually everything can be made into some form of a Silk Road. And I think, initially there was just an enormous amount of enthusiasm from other countries, particularly the initial set of countries that embraced it. Because this looked like, just free investment. And the world really does have a significant need for infrastructure investment. And China is the largest source of infrastructure lending, if not investment. So I think there was this enormous enthusiasm. But what countries have found is that as China has developed the Belt and Road Initiative, it's essentially the export of China's own model, which means that along with, that rapid economic development, that infrastructure-led growth, you get all of the externalities associated with the China model. You get, rapidly rising levels of environmental pollution and degradation. You get rapidly rising levels of debt in many instances. You get labor issues and concerns, and you get corruption. So, recently the Chinese government said about 40% of all Belt and Road projects are encountering difficulties, which basically means you've got protests around Belt and Road projects in every country where China is operating. And a number of leaders of these countries are also going back to Beijing to try to renegotiate terms or cancel projects. So I think that the best way to put it is that the Belt and Road has become increasingly bumpy. And that there is, I think, since 2016, the level of Chinese investment in the Belt and Road has declined steadily. And I think that reflects an understanding on the part of China that, this initiative probably, at least in its original form, doesn't have the legs to continue, on for much longer. I will just finish by saying, I think we're going to see it move away from that hard infrastructure to the digital and health Silk Roads over the next 2 to 3 years.
Now, the Chinese pose I guess we can argue about what kind of threat and how big a threat to American leadership in the world in a different way from the way the Soviet Union used to do. I mean, there are not tens of thousands of nuclear weapons facing each other between China and the United States. Having said that, they are certainly putting themselves out there as an authoritarian dictatorship with a system of organizing society that rivals the United States. And I well remember our own prime minister, when asked several years ago what country in the world he marveled at, he did say China, and went on to say their ability to get infrastructure built and some such things amazed him. And he's probably regretted saying that ever since, because his opposition critics never let him forget it at moments like this. Having said that, here's the question. if you live in a Western democracy, the notion that we'd want to trade in what we have for what they have is a non-starter. But apparently there are plenty of countries in the world who find it appealing. What's the appeal?
So I think it's important to distinguish between what leaders of other countries find appealing and what populations find appealing, and exactly what elements of the China model have been exported to certain places. So again, I think in certain countries, what's appealing about the China model is the rapid economic development. And countries that have been starved for investment from the West, or who've had a lot of conditions put on them by the multilateral development banks, can often look upon Chinese sort of no-string investment as very attractive. Authoritarian leaders, of course, are enticed by the China model because China can export, not only this infrastructure, right, telecommunications infrastructure, but surveillance technology, and they offer opportunities for internet governance training. So you can learn from China how to control the internet, how to do real-time censorship of the internet. The first lady of Nigeria said, look, if China could control all of its population and its social media, I don't see why we can't do it. So I think for more authoritarian leaders, the China model is quite attractive. But that doesn't mean for the people in those countries, right, that where this authoritarian model is being bolstered by Chinese assistance, that they find the China model particularly attractive. So I think we need to distinguish, one of the things that came out in my research was really there are differences between how elites view China and how broader populations view China. There are differences between, for example, countries in Asia, which are much more concerned about China's security and military assertiveness than, say, countries in Africa or Latin America. Democracies are more worried about the surveillance elements than autocracies are. So, yes, there are certainly countries and leaders that marvel, as your prime minister did, at China's extraordinary economic success over the past, 40, 50 years. But I think when you drill down, I think you find sort of much greater variation in assessments of what, what that China model really brings or doesn't bring to the table.
Let me ask you about the Arctic, because Canada, of course, a significant chunk of Canada is in the Arctic, and a lot of Canadians care a great deal about making sure that that part of the world is free from mischief that could affect us. The two countries that we need to deal with as it relates to the Arctic are Russia and China, and we seem to, at the moment, have particularly lousy relations with both. Should we be concerned here in Canada that China has some fairly large aspirations as it relates to the Arctic?
Yeah, so it is interesting. Xi Jinping, likes to call China a, near polar power, on its way to becoming a great polar power, even though the nearest point in China to the Arctic is like 900 miles away. So who knows exactly what he's talking about? I think former Secretary of State Pompeo here said, there's no such thing, as a near polar power, right? You are either an Arctic country or you're not, and China is not. But what we have seen over the past decade or so is a very dramatic increase in China's aspirations in the Arctic, as you suggest, and it sits as an observer to the Arctic Council, right? Only the countries that are truly Arctic countries can be members of the Arctic Council, but China is an observer, and it is the most active of all the observers, and it submits many, many papers, and it does joint research and joint explorations with other Arctic countries, and it hosts scientific meetings around the Arctic. It has several thousand scientists in China devoted to Arctic research in one way or the other. It has an institute that focuses on the geostrategic implications of the Arctic. And of course, for a long period of time, it was making significant headway in terms of its investments in the Arctic, until gradually some of the countries began to think like, hey, why do you really want that defunct military base or airport? What are you actually planning to do with it? And you began to have communities in these countries, sometimes spurred by the United States, saying, maybe there are some security implications of this, and maybe we ought to put the brakes on this, because really, are you planning to put a golf course, and big resort in our country, or is there something else going on? So I think, China was making a lot of headway in terms of its partnerships with a number of Arctic countries, in terms of inserting itself. I think that's slowed down as countries have become increasingly concerned, but also watch for China's efforts to really transform the narrative around the Arctic from simply saying, that the Arctic, its resources and the security issues of the Arctic are really for the Arctic countries to decide, to China saying, listen, the real issue of the Arctic is climate change. And that's a global commons issue. And thus, more countries need to be involved in the decision-making process around the Arctic. And I think that's going to be the play that we see from China increasingly, as it sees, what its path forward is to greater influence in the region. I think that's going to be it.
I do want to get your advice on an issue that the Canadian government has really dragged its feet on, no doubt purposefully. This is a tough call, admittedly. 5G, Huawei. Lots of other countries have admitted China's Huawei Corporation in order to participate in the 5G project. The imprisoning of the two Michaels for more than 1,000 days has really made Chinese-Canadian relations awful right now, and there are plenty of people here who think that we ought not to open the door to China's participation through Huawei with that 5G network. What would you, if you were advising our Prime Minister today, what would you recommend?
I think there are other options that pose really, virtually no security risks. Ericsson and Nokia. I don't see any reason, to let the wolf into the hen house. Frankly, if there were no other option, then maybe. But we have Nokia, we have Ericsson, we have O-RAN moving forward, combination of different parts of the 5G technologies from different companies. I think this is the way forward. This is the way forward, I think, for smart democracies to move.
And yet we have companies that are in this space, in this country, who say it's got to be Huawei or bust. So he should just stare them down?
I don't know which companies those are, but I think a number of countries actually have moved the decision making around Huawei out of the political arena and into sort of their security agencies, and have found that once the security agencies do the deep dive, they come back and say, Huawei is probably too great a risk. And so maybe, I don't know where the decision-making locus is right now in Canada, but perhaps that's a path that the Canadian government could follow.
Okay. In our last few minutes here, I want to touch on one more thing, and that is, the leader of China, he's going to be there for life. That is obviously the way he has organized things to ensure that he's going to have this job for as long as he wants it. And therefore, I want to ask you, in a perfect world where things go according to the way Xi Jinping wants them to go, where is China in the world? What has it achieved? How different does it look 10 years from now?
Yeah. So that is at the heart of my book, I have to say. And you can read all 200 and some odd pages of it too and get my answer. But in short form, again, I think the important thing to recognize is that this really is a transformative vision, and that there is a degree of Chinese centrality on the global stage that we have, in our own lifetimes have never seen, right? That the map has been redrawn in the Indo-Pacific with China at the center. That you're looking in terms of, values on human rights and the internet to a much more state-directed sense of what values mean, human rights mean, where Chinese preferences are embedded in other countries, where Chinese military bases sort of dot the global landscape. And again, where Chinese norms and values are reflected in global governance institutions, so that, when China speaks, the world not only listens, but actually follows Chinese direction. So I think that is the world that Xi Jinping is driving to construct. I think he will find it increasingly difficult, because I think the harder that he pushes, the more pushback he's getting. So I think he has to modify his vision if he's to achieve any real success. But frankly, I think that's not within his personality. So ultimately, I don't think Xi Jinping realizes his sort of great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, on the grand scale that he has imagined.
That's the world according to China, and that's China according to Elizabeth Economy, whom we are extremely grateful to have on our program tonight here on TVO. Thank you, Elizabeth. Good to speak to you again.
Thanks again, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, February 17th, 2022. Tomorrow, Nam Kiwanuka looks into the churn and mobilizing on social media over the Ottawa protests. Hope you'll be with us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The Agenda is always on. To catch up on conversations from this week or any week, visit our website, tvo.org/theagenda, or our YouTube page at youtube.com/theagenda. It's all there for whenever you want to watch.
Since the beginning of time, we've been trying to save time.
No matter how rich you are, no matter your intelligence, no matter your socioeconomic status, everyone has 24 hours in a day.
We like things to be cheap, we like things to be immediate, and we like to save time.
Can we ever be fast enough?
Any time-saving invention that comes out, they